Welcome to Research Renaissance, presented by the Karen Toffler Charitable Trust. Embark on a journey into the forefront of cutting-edge brain science as we feature insightful discussions with a diverse array of guests, from early career researchers pioneering groundbreaking science to influential voices in investment communities, policymaking, and research institutions. Together, we delve into neurological diseases, their causes, treatments, and the quest for cures. Join us in advancing our understanding of the brain and addressing its ailments. Welcome to Research Renaissance. I'm Deborah Westphal, your host and guide through the fascinating future of the brain. Joining me today is Dr. Amy Bernard, the Director of Life Science at the Kavli Foundation, where she is the head of strategy and programs for the Neuroscience and Nanoscience divisions. Today's discussion is focused on understanding the intersections of bioscience and technology and academia and philanthropy. Let's dive in. Well, welcome, Amy.
Thank you so much, Deb. It's great to be here.
Yeah, I'm really excited. You have a extensive experience in research, innovation, philanthropy, and it just really gives you some unique insights and perspectives that I'm looking forward to hearing today. And I would like to just kind of jump in with, where do you see the intersection of nanoscience and neuroscience, and how is that shaping the future of brain research? Particularly just maybe in the understanding of the brain function, or, more kind of targeted the development of treatments for neurological disorders.
Well, thank you again for having me here. So my own background in terms of the dimensions of both nanoscience and neuroscience really start with my own career, where I was early on studying biophysics and genetics, things that are very small at the microscopic and submicroscopic scale of, fundamental building blocks of life. And I was fascinated by how these things work together to encode information that is ultimately going to be helping us read out into the creation of something as complex as a brain. And so, after spending about 16 years at the Allen Institute in Seattle, where I was working on a number of different neuroscience projects, I joined the Kavli Foundation to head up the department here of neuroscience. So the Kavli Foundation is a nonprofit philanthropy that funds basic research, fundamental research in the fields of neuroscience, nanoscience, and astrophysics and theoretical physics. So things that really span the very small, the very large, and the very complex. And pulling on my background, both in terms of the very small in the biophysics and genetics side, the very complex in terms of neuroscience that I was doing when at the Allen Institute, coming together with the Kavli Foundation really gave me an opportunity to marry these two important fields in a way that could move research forward. So in terms of the intersection of nanoscience and neuroscience, these are both complex fields. They both move incredibly quickly, and they both really rely upon very fundamental research to advance the causes of what we understand about ourselves, our system, everything from disease to functionality, and then how we can actually even manipulate those systems once we learn about them with technology and advancement in engineering, basically at a nanoscience level. So that's at a very sort of high level in terms of where there is intersection for me personally that can shape the future in terms of funding opportunities. But then there's so much to dig into in terms of the science itself and how in each of those different fields, broad research questions, and then areas in which there's complementarity where those two fields can work together to advance potentially treatment or even just understanding of the brain and of, physical phenomena.
So you mentioned your degree and biophysics. I don't know if there's a lot of people out there that would know what biophysics is. Can you just explain that just a little bit?
Sure. Well, the study of biophysics is actually pretty broad. For a lot of people, it really summarizes what's happening in a cell or in a biological system that is under the influence of physics. And for those of us who know something about physics, it's basically everything. So at the level of a cell, there are properties that, aren't necessarily encoded through information that's informed through, say, behavior or environment, but encoded through the properties of physics, which could be things that relate to, how ions move across a membrane, or how, say, the actin filaments use tensile strength, for example, to move or to grow in a cellular structure. So it's thinking about the physical properties that are in biological systems that could be as simple as a single cell or as complex as a whole organism. So the field of biophysics is, it's all encompassing. It's anything that relates to the physics of a biological system. And from that, you really get subdisciplines of everything from cell biology that could be looking at biochemistry or microbiology to properties that are more what we think about in terms of physiology, human biology, how ionic or exchange of oxygen, for example, in the lungs happens. That's another element that includes both human physiology as well as biophysics. So for the field of biophysics and genetics, which was what my degree was in, these are basic scientific questions of understanding how systems work in a living organism. And again, that goes from the very small into molecules and the properties of individual proteins in cells into things that are larger, the dynamics of how an organism might move.
I appreciate that. I took physics. I was an electrical engineer. So the physics that I studied were more the physical properties of things, big things. And so this combination of biology and physics is very interesting. And I'm sure we'll hit on this later in the discussion about just kind of this cross collaboration across fields and functions in science to really understand kind of new breakthroughs, new information, new knowledge. So I appreciate you going through that. You had mentioned your time with the Allen Institute, and you were a part of some pretty big projects that they did, mainly around the Allen Connectivity Atlas and the Human Brain Atlas, and then the brain mapping. This is a lot of information, a lot of data around the brain. Can you talk a little bit about those initiatives and then talk a little bit about how you envision these resources and how they're contributing to advancing the understanding of the brain and the diseases of the brain?
Sure. I love talking about what the Allen Institute does for three reasons. The first is that it started as a small, fairly constrictive scoped project that was simply to understand how many genes are active in a mammalian brain. And it turns out that the field didn't really know that. So there's been a huge amount of research, and this was over 20 years ago now, on the brain. But when you ask some pretty basic questions, in terms of understanding what does the brain do, what is it made of, something as seemingly fundamental as which of the genes in the body are turned on or active in a mammalian brain, researchers didn't know. And so actually through the prescience of Paul Allen, who was formerly a founder of Microsoft, he founded the Allen Institute, and he wanted to be able to make some accelerated progress in not just understanding the brain, but looking for cures for diseases such as Alzheimer's, such as schizophrenia, such as certain autism spectrum disorders, and really just to accelerate progress. So to do that, he asked questions of many different researchers. What are the gaps? What don't we have in the scientist's toolbox to make progress? And through a number of different sort of discussions with thought leaders, with really brilliant people in the field, he ascertained that what was needed was a map of the brain. And at the time, one of the ways of doing that in terms of the technology at that era, it was a really bold task to go about identifying what the genes were that were actually shaping and instantiating function in a mammalian brain. And so the Allen Institute was tasked with a project that would be to map the mammalian brain, identify the physical location and identity of genes within cells that impart properties to that brain. And that project started out roughly in about, give or take, about 2003. And at that time, researchers came together from multiple different fields with this shared goal, a project-driven goal of mapping out the brain. And these researchers included, you would imagine classic neuroscientists, researchers from laboratories, but researchers who are also informaticians, bioinformaticists, some physicists, some engineers, computational scientists, people who came together with this shared goal to build a resource for the scientific community to utilize, not just by generating data and publishing it in papers, which was sort of the conventional way of making progress with gaining knowledge, but through generating accessible tools that could be utilized through online databases by scientists around the world. Now, recall, this is around 2003. So this was actually pretty early in a stage of now what is seen as just a standard fact, is that information is available online openly to people who want to find it. Resources at that time simply were not available in that way. And so this sort of dedicated task of making data, first of all, generating the information that was manifest in the way of literally there would be sections of brain that were sliced into very thin sections. And that brain was subjected to chemical treatments that would reveal the presence or absence of certain genes across the entire mammalian genome. And then taking images of that data, of those sections of brain, transferring it into the way that you would look through a microscope was almost now you could look at your computer and visually see what that tissue looked like that either had a particular gene in it or did not. And that for scientists is really useful information to help understand the mechanisms of what might be possible through these genes, which create proteins, which add to function. So I joined that project at a time where for me, it was a super exciting opportunity to do something really new, use my background in understanding some of the technology of biophysics and genetics associated with the genetics in the brain, with the technical expertise to how to generate all of this data in the laboratory, and then to collaborate with colleagues of how to communicate that information out through web tools, through information technology portals that at the time did not exist. There was not a Google for the brain. There was not a way of having researchers access information through online web portals. We had to build that from scratch. And that's what the team did. So, that was about the very beginning of the Allen Brain Atlas. And based on the success of that project, in terms of its utility to neuroscience researchers, we had the opportunity through some federal funding that came through National Institute of Health grants and through some collaborative work that we were able to do with other partners of building out our concept of brain atlases. So from starting with a mouse brain atlas, where we mapped all of the genes in the mouse brain, adult mouse brain, we then went on to say, okay, well, we also want to know more about the human brain. We want to know more about non-human primates and how those are either similar or different. We want to know more about how the brain itself is wired. And we want to know more about the individual information for all the capabilities of cells in the brain, not just what genes are on, but what potentials do they have to have active functions, firing different action potentials as they are active in a living organism, not just in a static piece of tissue, which is what we looked for before. And so in a sort of modular way, very kind of organized fashion, the Allen Institute grew. My own role with the Allen Institute grew to lead first a team of people that was devising new methods for creating this data, to then actually running high throughput laboratory processes that would generate the data at scale, and then partnering with my colleagues in the information technology side of the organization to make all this data available to the community. And so this, spanned about 16 years of my time at the Allen Institute, during which time, again, I was just a very small part of a much bigger machine to work on creating information that would be digestible, usable by researchers around the world. And, I left there about 3 years ago. And during that time, the Allen Institute has continued to, grow, not just in their neuroscience space, but also in the fields of immunology, cell biology, and neural coding, areas that are looking at sort of active properties of the brain.
That's amazing. And, as you were describing that, I was thinking you said it started around 2003. This is kind of on the heels of the genome being mapped and that understanding. And, I think we forget just how new this is and the science around this. I'm curious because I have talked to other researchers that are really kind of studying the brain and the diseases, and I've asked the question around the differences or the diversity of individual brains. How different are they? And you went through that process of looking at a lot of different brains, a lot of different samples, if you would. How is this? Is that diversity or the boundaries of the diversity, if you would, is that represented in the data, or how can you explain what that is?
Absolutely. I love this question about the diversity of brains, because it's a lot like thinking about, forests and trees and things like that, where, you can look at a forest and you can say, oh yeah, there are many different trees there and they're all trees. And I understand they're all trees, and hence they're all very similar because they're all trees. And then you look at the individual trees and you're like, oh, well, actually, I see that there are conifers and there are deciduous trees. So there's maybe two different kinds of trees there. And then you look some more and you're like, well, actually, amongst the conifers, I see now that there's Doug firs and there's junipers and there's redwoods. And then when you start looking at the actual trees themselves, you realize that no two trees are alike at all. The branches are different. They have different numbers of leaves. They grow at different rates. They physically have completely unique shapes. There are not two trees that are alike. And what I learned from physically looking at different human brains, which was a sort of exciting, fun part of my job, I actually got to look at postmortem brains, that while they're all very similar to certain degrees, every single one is unique. And we know this to be true just because, as humans, we've met other humans and we know that no two are the same. And that is recapitulated in what we actually see in the physical matter that is the brain. Everyone is a different size. Everyone has different sort of swirls on it, the sulci, or those sort of deep divisions that go into make these sort of invaginations within the brain. They're like thumbprints. There are no two that are just alike. And it's actually a little shocking because when you just sort of see people's heads, you think, oh, there must be something in there that's a brain and it's about the size of their head. But there's tremendous variability when you actually look at what that tissue appears like. It's very, very different, much like fingerprints. So that doesn't actually tell us anything about what's going on inside the brain, but it does. I don't know. It kind of surprises one, where you just think of brain as this sort of generic gray matter between your ears. And it's really much more beautiful and nuanced and profound when you see it. It's also something very private. I mean, this sounds a little strange, but nobody should ever really see a brain. It's within a head and it's a private thing. People's thoughts are private. And for the people that choose to donate tissue to science of any type, it's a tremendous gift to the scientists, and particularly something like the brain, which is the seat of so much. It's the seat of memory, the seat of emotion. To physically, be able to hold a human brain in one's hands because a patient or a loved one's family has donated it, it is profoundly precious. And I think that was something that I had a real opportunity and privilege to see as a researcher, working with donated tissue from people that recognize the importance of that precious, precious gift to the research community. And yes, everyone is unique. Every brain is different. And even when you're just looking at it, those differences in no way capture the tremendous beauty and diversity that is within, that we can never access by looking at just the tissue itself, which is why I do think that we can get a lot of information about, sort of as a reverse engineering approach, of what does make the brain work in the living state is built by what it is in the material state. And we can do a lot to piece together what that, hardware is that's ultimately going to run the software. And we have to do that in order to start getting a sense of what the software is capable of.
And that's the link. That's the link back to the biophysics. Is that understanding of the mechanism, and the mechanisms are they pretty common amongst the diversity of the brain? So because it would seem to me that if we're trying to find therapeutics or understanding diagnostics, that we have to have some kind of commonality of the function of the brain to be able to, build out those things to address some of the diseases or those conditions. Is that correct?
That is correct. And we also know that from a lot that's been learned from model organisms. So we know that the physics, physics is physics, and that doesn't vary from person to person. But the way in which each brain is assembled in terms of the cells, the circuits, and the connections, that is, we're finding to be more complex in terms of the implication of what that complexity does impact, for example, how treatment will be either impactful or less impactful for individuals. So this again comes back to kind of this fundamental challenge where we know a lot about the brain, but we still don't really know how it works, the big picture of how the brain works. And so, much like there's a lot of talk now about artificial intelligence, I see there are a lot of parallels between what we think about things like ChatGPT, artificial intelligence, training new systems that are effective at doing things. We can see the outcome, but we don't necessarily understand the mechanism and the how and how it got there. That's very much a situation, I would say, with the human brain or even, non-human brains. We can see what they're capable of, and we can see what happens when we manipulate either pharmaceutically or therapeutically different elements of the brain. But we are really in our infancy for understanding the mechanisms because we don't understand kind of the master principles for how the brain does work. We don't have a roadmap for this, and we don't have an instruction manual. So there is a lot of, try something, see what happens, and then we document what that thing is without understanding the root principles. But we actually, ironically, do know a lot more about the root principles of biophysics. So there are things at the molecular level in terms of, say, how pharmaceutically one particular molecule might bond to a cognate receptor. So if there's a particular, say, neurotransmitter receptor such as dopamine, we can study the biophysics of binding, of how dopamine might bind to a receptor that is located in a cell in the brain. And you can measure very clearly what the on-off rates are for that particular chemical. But in terms of how that relays communication across the whole brain, that is what we don't yet have access to. So intriguingly, some of the fundamental biophysics is actually almost the easiest part. It's the part that we don't have the ability to control yet, the entire circuitry of the brain working together, what all the different roles are for individual cells in the brain, and then how they collaborate. How there's responsiveness of one part of the brain that, may be in charge of learning and memory. We know that when there's damage to certain parts of the brain, there's compensatory action that allows some restoration. Well, how does that work? We don't know that yet. We do know that, for example, the structure of the brain of the hippocampus is the seat of a lot of learning and memory, but not all. And what are those factors that control the relay between which parts of the brain actually hold memories? Is it the hippocampus? Is it parts of the cortical areas? Is it parts of the amygdala? It's some special orchestra of all of those areas. And then what those triggering factors are between how memories shift. For example, in somebody who's undergoing cognitive decline, we just don't have the information yet. And that's where this fundamental pursuit of really unraveling the mysteries of the brain is what's going to help us with those sorts of cures, treatments, therapeutics that honestly at a pharmaceutical level are a lot easier to understand than the entire integrated level of, actually how a human being works.
So we started this conversation on studying the Kavli Foundation studies, or supports the very big in astrophysics, and then the very small in nanoscience. And it seems that that theme continues with inside the brain. You're saying that sometimes it's easier to understand the very small than the larger system of the brain. And that's very helpful, I think, to just kind of think about where we're at with that understanding. I would like to circle back a little bit more. You mentioned, you mentioned the Kavli Foundation and what it does, and some of the focus. But can you expand a little bit more about what just its history, why it was created, and really what is the major emphasis that the foundation does?
Sure. So the Kavli Foundation is a nonprofit science philanthropy organization that was founded actually about 20 years ago by an engineer and entrepreneur named Fred Kavli. Fred Kavli was a Norwegian American. He came to the United States originally from his home country of Norway and proceeded to have a lot of success both as an entrepreneur, as an inventor in a number of different fields of his interest. One of the things he was most passionate about was the importance of scientific discovery to make the world a better place. Really, the role of science in just driving discoveries that would uplift all of humanity. He really was an optimist in that way and believed that part of what was really important for these advances to happen was for scientists to have the flexibility to pursue, crazy ideas or ideas that might be, still not yet proven, and to make mistakes, to take risks, to try something out and then be able to, try something different if the original idea didn't work right. And so I think his vision and his appreciation for both kind of the beauty and the excitement of discovery was what really inspired him to commit his resources and his philanthropy. And he's been passed now for some years. But his legacy lives on through the support of fundamental research in science in these fields that were close to his heart, as you've mentioned: nanoscience, neuroscience, and astrophysics. He felt these fields were the fields of the future, where there was still a lot of unknown questions or unknown ideas and real opportunity to advance our understanding of ourselves as humans. For fundamental questions like how do we think? What is cognition? But then also from a practical perspective, how do we make our lives better? What technology is needed so that we can advance our communications, advance our materials. In terms of material sciences, what's needed so that we can mitigate damage that's due to anthropogenic climate changes. So how can we be a more sustainable community in terms of our consumption? So he had a lot of questions, but wasn't wanting to limit his philanthropy to his own questions. He wanted to broaden this to science for the entire future, and that was what he did. He created the Kavli Foundation as an organization to fund science in perpetuity through an endowment that would be constantly looking to the edge of what are those questions for the future that we need to address, and who are the scientists, who are the thought leaders that we want to support, who are going to be paving the way to really, betterment of humanity through scientific discovery. And the areas that are right now in the practice for the Kavli Foundation include the awarding of a Kavli Prize in those three areas of research. That's awarded every 2 years. It's an international award, really within the fields, it's on par to a Nobel Prize because it's recognizing key scientists in the fields of nanoscience, neuroscience, and astrophysics who have contributed, really great seminal accelerated ideas to the field. It's a very prestigious prize, the Kavli Prize. It's actually awarded by the King of Norway every 2 years. And this year, in fact, is a Kavli Prize. There'll be an announcement in June of who the awardees are. So I encourage people to track that important information. So in addition to awarding of the prize, we do create grants to award to individual scientists who are doing work that can accelerate discovery in these fields. We curate our areas of focus into what we see are areas of particular opportunity. Right now in neuroscience, some of the areas that we're focusing on are really allowing scientists to promote open data in neuroscience, so sharing of their information, and then utilizing information that's been generated by others. This is an area that we have a strategic focus on. We also focus in an area that we call observing and measuring the mind, which is an area that we recognize embraces accelerated discovery for advances in technology, for things like, the next and best microscopes, or new strategies for identifying molecules that can be seen almost as detection molecules in our ability to tag or view different subtypes of the brain. And there's just a lot of new discovery that can be moved forward through new technological advances.
So, open science, and that is an emphasis that you talked about. And it seems that the work that you did at the Allen Institute was open science too, trying to make that available to everybody. Can you talk about the importance of that, especially in today's environment where we're talking about privacy and information and who owns the information? And in the area of neuroscience, my brain has information and it's, diverse to me and unique to me. Why is open science so important? And what's the conflict with maybe this question around privacy?
Deb, these are the most essential questions you just asked. These are just amazing questions because open science is a few different concepts. First, it captures the notion that information really should be accessible to other people as opposed to being contained within, say, some arcane publication that's only available to university libraries. That now, in the age where information is available broadly to a lot of people around the world through the internet, the notion that all important discoveries in science are contained on a dusty shelf of a library, it's just outdated. Yet the world that a lot of scientists live in is still the way that they communicate information, is through publication, through scientific journals that have paywalls, that have processes for review that are not very friendly in terms of making sure that there's openness to all people. It's openness to a few people that might be already embedded in the field or who might have access through a particular university system. So it's this idea of just bringing forth scientific information so it's accessible. And that's very much of a broadening participation in the scientific enterprise. Philosophically, that is one of the definitions of open science. Well, there's another definition of open science that's very practical, that more comes down to the concept of utilizing open data and specifically principles that scientists called FAIR data, which is findable, accessible, interoperable, and reproducible. And this relates more to the concept of rigor in how scientists gather their information and then how they document that information so that others can have confidence in it. And this is really important right now, particularly in the day and age of reproducibility and trust in science, where scientists need to trust scientists, the public needs to trust science. And fundamentally, that means that they have to have confidence that things are done well. It's the most basic thing. Scientists should keep accurate notebooks. They should describe their methods well, and they should be able to reproduce their work and describe it to others in a very, clear, concise manner. And now that we have a lot of really, really, really complex technical ways of acquiring data and just complex paradigms for analyzing everything, it creates a larger burden on that sort of reproducibility work. And so it's actually difficult for scientists to sometimes make their data simplified in a way where it can be used by other scientists. It takes effort and it takes sometimes money to make that data usable by others. And so the concept of open science and open data is one that also embraces the fact that, scientists need to take that time. It matters for that science to be robust. And then the third aspect of open science is the one that you also mentioned in terms of essentially the ethics, the rights of the individuals. When you're talking about something like neuroscience or brain science, you're not studying just a clam on the beach. You're studying something that is a human, that's a person that has thoughts and feelings and rights. And so the concept of open science, when you're talking about, again, neuroscience, is a little different. It's the stakes are higher. It's about people. It's about rights to our own information. And it's also about what one learns through that science. So for example, if somebody has a CAT scan, if somebody has, a scan where there's certain predictive pieces of information that can now be read by scientists, it's fine to say, I would like that information to be usable by any scientist. But what if that use of information actually yield something that says something about the person that they see as very private or personal. I think that most reasonable people would agree that there do need to be limits on how that information is shared. And that's where the technology associated with, walking that line between making information usable and reusable to other scientists so that they can maximize that information for discovery purposes has to be balanced with, rights of privacy, rights of ownership, how best, say, to encrypt information, things that do get both technological and complex and require planning, require ethicists, and require, concerted thought into how best to be good stewards. And in fact, at the Kavli Foundation, we also have part of our work that focuses on science and society that includes a component of neuroethics. This is just about not telling people how to do things, but making sure that we are asking the right questions, bringing people to the table who can explore these complex questions. This is incredibly important to us being good stewards of valuable information, insights into ourselves as we, come back to our mission of advancing science for the benefit of humanity. Part of the benefit of humanity is really respecting the rights of individual privacy and information. So as a foundation, we care deeply about that, and we make sure to fund research and endeavors that hold those principles.
It seems that the role or the skills, attributes of a researcher are changing because of these things. Maybe it was a little easier 20, 30 years ago. You did more just research, but there seems to be what you're discussing is you got to be aware of all these other things that go into research. And if open science is the future, researchers need to take a more broader look or perspective of what they do and the skills that they have to do it. Is that correct?
That is correct. And I think that it's also about broadening the concept of who are the scientists into a bigger circle. So, it used to be that we would think of the scientist as the person who's holding the beaker or, looking in the microscope. And now science is it's a bigger party. It's a much broader enterprise. It does include data scientists. It includes ethicists. It includes communicators. It includes educators. And in terms of the making data available to the public, this doesn't happen immediately and it doesn't happen for free. It takes resources to make sure that somebody's, paying for the cloud storage. And it also takes the right kind of infrastructure and management plans to make the information available in ways that go beyond somebody just scribbling in a lab notebook. So, are the neuroscientists, maybe, if you're studying the brain, necessarily the best people to do that? No, there are people who are computational scientists. There are engineers who need to be brought into the picture. And I think that that's one of the really great opportunities right now. And thinking about not just neuroscience, but any of the scientific disciplines is they are interdisciplinary. They are collaborative. And for all of us to make progress, it means getting into a bigger tent, making sure that we are sharing our ideas with those who can help for something like open science. It includes those partnerships and those collaborations with people who are going to say, okay, this is the best way to make that data available. Oh, and here's an ethicist who's telling me what I might want to consider as I make that data available. Oh, and then here's actually somebody who's familiar with international law, because maybe the information that I gather in the United States is not always shareable in the same way that somebody who has in the European Union principles on what they can and cannot share due to slightly different regulatory requirements in the EU. So all of these considerations come into play when thinking about making data open and available. And, there's not an answer right now. There's never going to be one answer. It's all progress. And it's all part of the exciting exploration, I think, that right now we're looking at as a global community of scientists and friends.
That's great. Yeah, thank you for that. So you're unique, right? You've worked on the research side. Now you're a researcher background in philanthropy, kind of bridging those two those two worlds, what are the unique challenges that you see and opportunities that you see when you bring research and philanthropy together? Can you expand on that?
Sure. So I think that it's a dream job for me in the sense that when you're a scientist, you always say to yourself, "Oh, I wish that I could tell the funders exactly what we need so that they could just give us the money so we could do our work." And it's never that simple. People know that. But when you're stepping then into the philanthropy world, you realize that your entire goal is to help the scientists do their work. And so, it begs some big questions of then why, if the philanthropy world's purpose is to support the science, and I'm speaking about science philanthropy here, but you could extend this to many different areas. If the entire purpose is to accelerate and advance what those scientific researchers are wanting to do anyway, then shouldn't everything that we do be about asking those questions of the scientists? How can we be there for you? How can we be the wind under your wings? And so why is it that so many scientists sort of are in this mindset of like, oh, it's so hard for me to get the support that I need to move my research forward? It's kind of a conundrum. And so I see that better now that I have moved from the research side to the science philanthropy side. And I am also aware of some of the pain points that can be sort of cut through or accelerated through. So things, for example, like elaborate application processes. Philanthropists want to make sure that they are providing resources, which are, there's always more demand for resources than there is supply. So they want to make sure that they're picking the best possible ideas to fund the greatest scientists, the most promising work. And so to do that, they create rigorous processes for acquiring those funds, namely applications. But do they really want scientists to be spending, a third of their time applying for grants? No, they want scientists to be moving forward. And so that means getting creative as a philanthropist about how do we cut forward and reduce the time it takes, for example, to apply for the grant so that we can get the funds to the researchers faster, but also be confident that we're picking the right scientists. And actually, there's some exciting opportunities, even when you think about AI or just, thinking outside of the box about how we can accelerate that process, maintain the rigor, align with the mission, but make sure that we're making it as easy as possible for scientists to do their research. So I think, my experience both as a scientist and now on the philanthropic side, I'm able to try to sort of provide answers to some of the questions I had in the past and anticipate questions of the researchers to better meet those needs and, cut through some of those barriers.
So these early career researchers, I know the Karen Toffler Charitable Trust, kind of focuses on those folks that are just starting to get their career started as a professional researcher, if you would. What advice do you give them when you're coaching, mentoring? What is their responsibility in communicating their science and communicating what they want to do to try to get funds from the Kavli Foundation or other philanthropists to be able to cut through some of that red tape, if you would, or speed up that process? Because there's a responsibility for them. What are those key things that would make them more successful?
Yeah, so early career scientists are some of my favorite to work with because they have all the magic ingredients right there already. So I would say the number one thing is a passion for what you do. Scientists go into the field always for the passion, and it's certainly not for the money or the recognition. It's because they genuinely want to solve a problem, answer a question, learn something about a system. These are what drive scientists to go into science in the first place. And they need to retain that passion. So early career scientists sometimes will get a little bogged down by feeling like they have to be checking all the boxes for all of the many parts of their career that do make demands on them. So oftentimes there's demands to be a professor, there's the demands to write the grants, there's the demands to be teaching or training students, and then there's still the basic research demands. So it can be difficult to prioritize those things. And I think for funders, and certainly at the Kavli Foundation, we try to retain who's still thinking about the tough questions in science and align our goals to those visionary thinkers. So different foundations have different approaches. And that's another thing that I think is important for early career researchers to do is start familiarizing themselves with who are the funders out there. There are federal funders that certainly have a particular mandate, particularly in the fields of health sciences, the National Institute of Health, the National Science Foundation. But there are a lot of others out there. And I think that the earlier scientists recognize that they should build partnerships or at least inform those funding agencies about what they're doing, what they're excited about, where are their opportunities, and establish those connections. That's something that can never start too early. And I know as a researcher myself, nobody really told me that. I didn't get that memo. You don't have a class that teaches you that. So it's good to know that they should be building relationships with those funders, following their passion, and then also really just relying on networks to ask questions, learn from others in the fields. What do you do? Tell me a little bit about your day. Tell me a little bit about what you think is successful. Where do you think the field is going? And as you're asking those questions of others, they will be asking questions of you as well. And it will become a sort of reciprocal learning cycle. So establishing those connections, retaining your passion, and then also learning your elevator pitch for your own research. That's a big part of it. It can be very hard to cut through complex ideas, and you'll never get it 100% right. But it's great if you can have a really succinct, comprehensible way of describing your research to people who aren't necessarily scientists. That's just good practice anyway. And for funders as well, they'll appreciate that when you can communicate your ideas really succinctly.
Yeah, that's good because, we want these people to be successful. We want them to stay in research. We want them to continue on because it's good for all of us and it's important. So you're in the business of creating the future, if you would, by research and funding that research for the future. What are you most excited when you look out 5 or 10 years from now? What are you kind of most excited for? What advancements or innovations are you most excited about?
I am most excited about what I don't know yet. So I'm excited about the surprise of what is ahead. Basically, I'm saying I don't know what I'm surprised about or what I'm passionate about because it hasn't happened yet. But what I am excited about right now are 2 thematic areas that we're pursuing right now at the Kavli Foundation with some fundamental research funding that we have provided in nanoscience and neuroscience. So we have sort of complementary areas we're looking at. One of the areas in neuroscience is this new thematic focus that we've created through a program that we're actually collaborating with the National Science Foundation on right now. And the program is called Neurobiology and Changing Ecosystems. And what that concept is about is recognizing that we don't have a whole lot of information about how climate change is impacting the brain at a cellular and molecular level, or actually any other level beyond there. So we know when we study things like cancer or Alzheimer's disease, we've already had a pretty, there's a lot of information about those manifestations, those disorders in terms of, what they do, how damaging they are. We know what those diseases are. But when we say, what is the impact of, say, a changing environment, be it pollutants in the air, or be it an increase in carbon dioxide or an increase in temperature, what are these changes having on the brain? That's actually a research in progress. We are the experimental model in that ourselves. And neuroscientists haven't really tackled that yet as a question. So the Kavli Foundation is really excited about essentially seeding a new area. For particularly early career researchers have been super excited by this concept of learning more about how the brain functions in a changing environment. Specifically one which is now dealing with the perturbations that come through certain types of degradation to our environment. And this could be something related to humans or something like fish. So an example is that certain kinds of fish are exposed to, say, loud noises that are a result of boat noise, and it interferes with the way they communicate and they hear, and that actually changes the way they perceive information that's auditory information. And we have researchers that we funded to understand more about this so that they can understand about the resilience, how there can be mechanisms to circumvent this in terms of either modifying that low frequency boat noise potentially, or looking at a subset of fish that can actually evolve in a way to compensate for that problem. So there's a lot of really fundamental sciences that is yet to come through this experiment. A lot of people say, oh, gloom and doom, this is terrible because there's environmental change. And while it's not good in a lot of ways, I like to think that we have an opportunity to sort of make lemonade from lemons by seeing this as an experimental paradigm that we can actually understand resilience, resilience mechanisms that occur in the natural world. Neurobiology and changing ecosystems is an area we're excited to learn more about. And we have a slightly complementary program that we're looking at in Nanoscience called Nanoscience for Sustainability, where we're trying to understand more about what kind of advances in materials science might allow us to, say, reutilize carbon in a way that could, say, make steel. We haven't done that yet. And there can be advances in materials science that might make that a possibility. So these are fundamental research questions that, again, coming back to our mission, might actually benefit humanity long term. There'll be lots of false starts and there'll be things that are crazy ideas that don't work. But for every, 50 ideas that are a little crazy, there may be one that does. And that could be the next big breakthrough. And that's what I'm excited to see, maybe in the next few years or maybe longer. But by sort of planting the seed corn, by supporting the researchers who are having those ideas, I'm really excited to see what comes next.
I love that. I wonder the impact of plastic and, on our bodies. I wonder about the increase of stress through the information age and just the speed at which we now operate as humans, and what is that doing? I'm also very curious about, when you study it, this globally, and where there's cultures that aren't moving as slow, do they have the rate of some of these neurological diseases, the growth of these neurological diseases versus what we have in the United States? I've traveled to Africa and they move at a very different pace. They have different stresses for sure, but there's a different pace, and they don't have the plastics. They don't have necessarily the electromagnetic pollution, if you would, that we do here. So I think this focus that you are embarking on is just absolutely amazing and very exciting, because they're important questions. Because is our lifestyle and what we're creating, this ecosystem that we're creating and living in, what is that impact to us? I think are really, really important. So that's wow, that's cool. And that would be just really fun to be a part of. So as we're kind of on that note, as we're wrapping up here, how would people get a hold of you and the Kavli Foundation? How do people get a hold, just to ask questions or to collaborate, or possibly get some attention and funding?
Yeah, so the easiest way to find us is to probably visit our website at kavlifoundation.org. So KavliFoundation.org. There's a lot of information about our programs there. There's information as we have funding opportunities that we will make available through that website. Just, gives a view of the things that we're excited about. Also provides sort of some insights, little news features on what we're passionate about. And kind of our whole portfolio is, of course, accessible on that website. I'm personally accessible anytime somebody wants to drop me an email or anything. science@kavlifoundation.org is the email address to send to. I'm always excited to hear about people's inspirations, their new ideas. We come up with ideas not just from our own heads, but from hearing what other people think is exciting, and then kind of landscaping and scouting out what those new ideas are. So I like to always be a sponge to what the scientific community or others think, like, what could be cool? And that's a way to give me that feedback, is to just shoot me an email at science@kavlifoundation.org. The other way people can sort of get in touch with us more broadly is, we have newsletters that you can sign up for through our website. We have a lot of the social media penetration that people can look for to follow. In terms of establishing questions about what might be fundable. Is there a cool idea? That's again where you can reach out directly by email or by their inquiry mechanisms that are supported through our website. You can always bump into me at an interesting conference. I attend a lot of the neuroscience annual neuroscience conferences, a lot of, again, the conferences that are in the nanoscience and neuroscience space. But really, I like to be really open to people through also even something like LinkedIn, other types of social. Any great ideas, I welcome them. We don't officially, as a foundation, we don't take unsolicited proposals, meaning we don't have a mechanism for just funding any idea. We do these calls for proposals. So it may be that even though there's a cool idea you share with it, it doesn't necessarily mean that we can, write you a check. But I think it's actually it's part of what I'm excited about hearing from the community. Just even if it's not actionable items, it's what do you think is so cool that we should be funding it? Those are important pieces of feedback for us. And we also are excited to just constantly think about, like, challenge us and tell us what you think we shouldn't be doing. If there's something that you see that we're doing that's just not the coolest thing, we want to hear that too.
That's very generous and with your time and just the accessibility. I'm going to give you the last word here. Is there anything that you wished we would have talked about that we just didn't get to?
Oh, wow. Well, I've really enjoyed this conversation with you, Deb. And actually, I think that there are some, bigger questions maybe for some other conversation or a broader group of people sometime that could really focus on, what more can science philanthropy do to explore that future of brain science together. So, we're all doing our best as individuals, but it is, related to your last question. I'm eager for ideas from the community and from sort of the broader world of, if you think about kind of the free enterprise space of what do people really think the most important questions are to address? And then how do we create a path forward to do that? Not just as individuals, with my role at the Kavli Foundation or, through Toffler, through others, but, how can we act more in an interactive ecosystem to get ideas from the community, from scientists, from the general public, and then create paths towards accomplishing those goals? I see that as sort of that's an aspiration that I have. And, it's more than what can fit into a podcast, but it's something I think about, and I wonder if others do too.
Well, let's pursue that. And let's keep that dialogue, whether it's on a podcast or whether it's, in panels or just even in private conversations. Let's continue to have that dialogue because it is important. And as you said, the collaboration amongst the players in the organizations are so important. So, Amy, I really appreciate your time, your insight, your perspective, your energy, and your positive outlook for the future. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you for joining Research Renaissance. For more information and to stay updated, subscribe for more episodes and visit our website at tofflertrust.org. Feel free to call us if you have any thoughts, suggestions, or just want to find out more about the Karen Toffler Charitable Trust. Until we meet again, onward and upward.